Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to try and grab a roadmap to understand something that feels incredibly vast
And overwhelming.
and overwhelming, yeah. We're talking about the architecture of systemic issues. So not just, isolated incidents, but problems that are woven so deeply into our policies and structures that they're almost invisible.
Right, until they affect you directly. And that's really our mission here for you, the listener. We want to give you a shortcut. To move beyond that purely theoretical idea of systemic,
Okay.
we want to show how these things actually show up in daily life, how they shape real outcomes for people, especially from marginalized groups.
We're looking at the fabric of institutions, right?
Yeah.
Education, healthcare, law enforcement.
Exactly.
The policies that might even look neutral on paper, they
Mhm.
they still create these profoundly unfair results.
And to get there, we have to start at the foundation. You just can't analyze today's society without looking at the centuries of battles against injustice that built it.
That makes sense. When we look back at history, we often just, celebrate the big wins. But maybe we need to focus on what those fights didn't solve.
That's the perfect way to put it.
Like take the civil rights movement, mid-20th century, a massive response to legal segregation, to blatant discrimination.
Absolutely. And it was incredibly effective. I mean, it led directly to landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right, and the Voting Rights Act of 65.
Exactly. But here's the key thing. The system, even when the law changes, it has this incredible inertia.
Inertia, I like that.
Segregation didn't just vanish, it just shifted from being a legal rule, like separate water fountains, to becoming a systemic habit.
A habit baked into things like housing policy.
Housing policy, hiring, school funding, it went underground in a way.
That idea of institutional inertia that really feels like the core of what systemic means. It's one thing to defeat a law. It's another thing entirely to dismantle a cultural and financial practice.
You see the exact same pattern with gender.
With the women's suffrage movement.
Right. They secured the 19th Amendment in 1920, a huge legal victory. But that was really just the starting line.
It was the start of the race, not the finish.
Precisely. It secured the vote, but the fight for economic and, broader gender equality was just beginning. You don't just erase centuries of exclusion with one amendment.
So it persisted in things like the wage gap.
The wage gap, occupational segregation, things we are still very much fighting today.
And what about economics? If we look beyond identity and focus on economic power, the labor rights movement seemed crucial.
Oh, absolutely. Late 19th, early 20th centuries, that fight for fair wages, for safe conditions, it was fundamentally about pushing back against a system built to favor capital over labor.
And they won protections, minimum wage, workplace safety standards.
They did. But the fact that those protections are constantly being challenged or rolled back shows you that this is a cyclical, ongoing struggle. It never really ends.
Okay, so that sets the stage. That's the history. Now let's connect the dots. How do policies from decades ago still shape someone's life today? Where do these issues hide? I think we have to start with education.
Education is probably the clearest example of how old policy creates modern, measurable disparity. And to talk about that, you have to talk about redlining.
Redlining. It was an actual federal policy, right? Not just a loose practice.
It was official policy. Starting in the 1930s, they literally drew maps, marked minority neighborhoods in red ink, labeling them high risk for any kind of housing loan or investment.
Okay, for anyone who might not know the direct connection, can you just walk us through it? Why does a map from 80 years ago affect, say, a third grader's classroom now?
Because of how we fund our schools. In most of the country, public school funding is tied directly to local property taxes. So redlining systematically crushed property values in those red zones for generations. And even after the practice was outlawed, the financial damage was done. The wealth just wasn't there.
So less funding for schools.
Dramatically less funding, which means, crumbling buildings, fewer resources, no modern science labs, not enough guidance counselors, all compared to a school maybe just a few miles away in a historically green zone.
That is. There's a definition of a systemic issue, a financial structure that holds a kid back before they even walk in the door.
And you see the results. Standardized test scores, graduation rates, they consistently mirror those old maps.
And then a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic hits.
And it doesn't create new problems, it just pours gasoline on all those existing fires. It exposed what we call the digital divide.
What did that look like?
It looked like a massive infrastructure failure. Students in low-income families, often in those same red-lined areas, They didn't have reliable broadband. They didn't have laptops for remote learning.
So they just fell behind.
The learning loss was catastrophic for those students. It widened achievement gaps that were already huge. The system was only ever built to work for people who already had resources.
That's such a powerful bridge to the next point, because a failure in the education system almost guarantees you're going to face hurdles in the healthcare system.
Absolutely. Lack of economic stability immediately impacts your health. The disparities there are just as stark.
And when you look at racial disparities in health, the history it's particularly dark.
It is. We have to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't just a mistake. This was a 40-year-long project where hundreds of African-American men were deliberately denied treatment for syphilis.
They were told they were getting free medical care?
They were told they were getting treatment, but they were being studied. Researchers just wanted to see what the disease did to the human body if left unchecked. It was a profound betrayal.
And that's not just a historical footnote. That creates a shadow that lasts for generations.
It's a living shadow. That exploitation created a deep and, frankly, irrational mistrust of the healthcare system among many African Americans.
And that mistrust affects behavior today.
It can lead to reluctance to seek timely care, to participate in public health programs. It feeds right back into the cycle of disparity.
And then you layer on top of that the current socioeconomic factors.
Of course. If you have economic instability, you probably don't have good health insurance. You can't afford preventative care. You might live in an area with more pollution.
So you see higher rates of chronic illness.
Exactly. Higher rates of asthma, diabetes, heart disease. It's not just about individual choices. It's about the conditions the system forces people to live in.
Okay, let's pivot to the job market. This almost feels like the final step, where the failures in education and healthcare all come together.
They really do. The struggle starts long before you even submit an application. We see these historical barriers pop up again and again in modern hiring.
You're talking about things like unconscious bias.
Unconscious bias is a huge one. How does it work? Well, there have been countless studies.
The ones with the resumes?
Exactly. You send out the exact same resume word for word, but one has a name that sounds traditionally white and the other has a name that sounds traditionally African American.
And the one with the white-sounding name gets way more callbacks.
Significantly more. That's unconscious bias in action. It's not necessarily someone saying, I'm going to discriminate. It's a systemic pattern of preference, a cultural default.
And that kind of exclusion, it just starts a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
But even if you get the job, the problems don't stop. Let's talk about wage disparity.
The wage gap is so stubborn. We all know the statistic about women earning less than men, but it gets much worse when you factor in race and ethnicity.
And it's not just about equal pay for equal work.
Right.
It's about the kinds of work people are funneled into.
That's occupational segregation. Marginalized groups are often pushed into lower-paying sectors. Think about care work, hospitality.
Jobs with less room for advancement.
And fewer benefits and less security, which leads directly to job insecurity. These are the workers who are first to be laid off in a downturn. It just reinforces the wealth gap over and over.
It's a structure built to exclude.
That's what it is.
So policy feels like the linchpin in all of this. It can either mirror these inequalities or it can be the hammer you use to break them.
Policy is absolutely crucial. It sets the rules of the game. And when policies are designed without thinking about how they'll impact different communities differently, they almost always make things worse.
We already talked about redlining, which is the perfect example of policy creating a problem.
Right.
But what about in criminal justice? The policies around, say, mandatory minimum sentencing.
Or the war on drugs, starting in the 80s. These policies fundamentally changed the system. It stopped being about rehabilitation and became almost entirely about punishment.
And the data is clear on who that affected most.
Overwhelmingly, communities of color were targeted for nonviolent drug offenses. It led to mass incarceration, it broke up families, and it created cycles of poverty that are nearly impossible to escape. The policy itself became a tool of social control.
But on the flip side, policy can be a tool for reform.
It can.
You have something like the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was designed to undo the damage of redlining.
It was a necessary step, absolutely. But it's also important to see its limits. The act outlawed segregation by law de jure segregation.
But not segregation in practice.
Exactly. It couldn't just erase the massive de facto segregation, the economic and cultural realities that were already there. And honestly, for decades, it wasn't even enforced very well. So policy is essential, but it's often not enough on its own.
Which brings us to, I think, the most important part of this whole conversation.
What can we do?
Individual action. We've laid out the history, the sectors, the policies. For you listening, what's the next step? How do you translate this knowledge into actual, genuine action?
Well, it really starts with awareness and education, which, by listening to this, you're already doing, but keep going. Seek out the nuance in books, documentaries, community meetings.
Because you need to understand the problem before you try to fix it.
You need to. Then the next step is to amplify voices. And I don't just mean, liking a post on social media.
Right.
I mean, using your platform, whatever size it is, to share good information and show up. Go to your local town council meeting, your zoning board meetings. So much of this stuff happens at a really granular local level.
Showing up matters.
It really does. And finally, support the initiatives that are already out there. Volunteer your time or your skills. Donate, if you can, to organizations that are fighting for policy reform on the ground.
It feels like the key is that individual efforts are the spark, but you need collective action to actually create a fire that can challenge these huge entrenched systems.
That's it, exactly. These are ongoing challenges. They aren't relics of the past. Dismantling this architecture of inequality, it takes constant work.
So as we close this deep dive, I wanted to leave you, the listener, with a final question to think about. Given everything we've covered, the long shadow of policies like redlining and Jim Crow, which specific system, education, healthcare, or employment, do you think is most vulnerable to rapid positive policy reform right now, and why?
It's a tough question.
It is. Something to mull over as you see these systems playing out around you every day.
We hope you keep exploring those tough questions.
Thanks for diving deep with us.